Welcome to the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This podcast is dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like all the best bookshops, this podcast is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. So tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book at the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. I'm Stacey Horan, author, book lover, and host of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This is episode number 173. For more information about this or any of our episodes, go to my website, staceyhoran.com. If you enjoy the podcast, leave us a review, like us on social media, and share us with your friends, family, and fellow readers. In today's episode of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet, I'm chatting with author Susan Cole about her new memoir, Holding Fast. It is Susan's story of leaving everything behind to follow her husband's lifelong dream of sailing away. Susan has lived on or around sailboats for most of her life, but when she married John in her early 20s and agreed to live with him on a sailboat, she had never sailed before. After living on several different boats, Susan and John eventually embarked on a 3-year voyage through the Caribbean with their 7-year-old daughter and their dog, Elmo. In her book, Susan recounts the joys of offshore sailing, as well as the many trials and tribulations, including the experience of riding out a hurricane. It was an adventure that profoundly changed their lives forever. In this episode, I'll chat with Susan about her writing journey, her advice for anyone thinking of sailing away, and how the title of her book, Holding Fast, relates to her husband's favorite sailor's knot, as well as a few other things. Coming up. Susan Cole, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast.
I'm delighted to be here.
I thought what we could do today is start by talking about your new memoir, Holding Fast, a memoir of sailing, love, and loss. If you don't mind, tell us a little bit about this book and what inspired you to write it.
Sure. The book is, in one sentence, the book is about leaving everything behind and sailing away. It was a long-time dream of my husband, and a dream that many people have but don't actually get to do. And just as a little bit of background, my husband and I met at work in our 20s, each married to the wrong person. We each got married young. And after a few years, we left our marriages, got together. And the first thing he proposed, he had sailed all his life. And the first thing he proposed was that we should buy a 1903 Fire Island ferry boat to live on in Long Island Sound. I was from Ohio. I had never sailed. And I thought this, so you might think, I'd think, oh, what a terrible idea. I thought this was the most romantic thing in the world. So that's what we did. We lived out in Long Island Sound on this ferry boat for 5 years. It sank. We then got another boat, he really wanted a sailboat. He was a sailor. And we got a 50-ton giant sailboat that was built in Norway. It was built as a pilot boat to guide the big ships in. But anyway, it was so heavy that actually it was very, very difficult to sail. But very beautiful with lots of wood. We lived on that for 10 years. I finally convinced him to get a house. We moved on land. I thought maybe the dream would abate. We had a daughter, and his dream just got bigger. And we got another very seaworthy boat. And when our daughter was 7, we sailed away. So that's what the book is, the story of our voyage. And what inspired me to write it is that when we wound up sailing. We didn't know how long we'd go for. We didn't know if we'd even like it. We'd never gone offshore. We'd only sailed basically in Long Island Sound and a little bit around New England. And we wound up sailing for 3 years. And I didn't want to go. I had so much conflict about leaving family and friends and our lovely home in Connecticut. And it turned out to just be such a wonderful adventure, and I learned so much about myself. And when we came back, a couple years after we came back, I began writing about it, and because it was such a transformational, life-changing experience. So that's what inspired me initially to start writing about it.
Explain for us the meaning of the title, if you don't mind.
Oh, yes. So John, my husband John, who sadly passed away 6 years ago, he really loved knots. Love a lot of sailors really love knots, and it was just like his thing, or one of his things. And his favorite knot was a bowline because it just always held. And before we, I for some reason resisted learning the bowline. I learned when we were on those old wooden boats. I learned the clove hitch. I learned a bunch of for some reason I thought the bowline was too hard. But before we left on our eventual voyage on our boat, which was called Laughing Goat, I practiced. I practiced on a pail, the handle of a pail, so I could make the knot correctly, and I knew it would always hold. And that's how I feel about how he held me. So that's
nice.
The reason.
What made you decide to sit down and write this book now, after all this time?
Yeah, it actually, I started writing about the voyage a couple of years after we got back, just sort of scribbles. And then I met someone who told me about the University of Iowa workshop, and I began going. They offer. I was working, so like they offered summer like 1 and 2 week workshops, and I started going in summers, and I just kept writing about the voyage. I went for actually probably 12 years, continually. And meanwhile, I got some of it published. And initially, it was just fun for me to write. I hadn't thought it would be a book. And eventually, I did realize I wanted to make it a book. John then got diagnosed with cancer. So life happened for a few years. And I wasn't writing. And then he passed away in 2016, and I went to lunch with a couple of high school friends in New York. I was there. My daughter was getting married, which was huge, after John had passed away and all. And I was there to get my mother's bride dress, and we went to lunch. One is now a well-known sculptor, and the other one is a writer in New York. And I told them about that I'd done all this and started this book, and what happened with John. They were just so encouraging and just brainstorming ideas and stuff. And it got me going again. And that was in 2018. And I finished it in 2020, and it was published last year.
What was it like revisiting all of those memories? Because it's quite a wild swing in experience that you had and that you tell about in the book. But what was it like going back and reliving all of those things?
Well, for me, it was wonderful. We really loved cruising. There were many stressful and difficult moments, which are all in the book, and crises. But basically, it was just a wonderful way to live, and I loved having all that time with my husband and daughter, and our dog Elmo, who's a character in the book. So when I was writing about it, I'd wake up early in the morning, and actually, John and I were living aboard a boat again after Kate, my daughter, got through high school and went off to college. We sold the house and got another boat. And I would wake up early and write about it, and it would be like I was back in the voyage. So for me, it was wonderful, actually.
Well, let's talk about the experience a little bit. First of all, I'm curious. Is it something you would recommend to others?
I've actually, I've had the opportunity to speak to sailing audiences, like at yacht clubs and sailing associations, and I have sometimes gotten questions, and even at bookstores from people who are just thinking about doing this. And one question I particularly remember, it happened to be at a yacht club. I was living in New Orleans then, and it was at the Southern Yacht Club there. And this couple was thinking of going, and she said, well, what happens to people's relationships when they do this? Which I thought was such a great question.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought about it, and I thought about all the people we had met, and my own observation is that if you have a strong relationship already, there's the opportunity for it to be to bond even more, which is what happened with us. But if you don't, I mean, if there's trouble already, it's only going to get worse. We did see many people, separating angrily, in some port somewhere in Belize, or something like that. So I don't think it is for everybody, but I think it's really an individual thing.
I was going to ask how it affected your family, your relationships with your husband, how it affected your daughter, how it affected the family you left on shore.
Oh, the family we left, I mean, our family that we left behind.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, they were all mad that we did this. They thought it was really crazy. My husband's sister, who his dad had a sailboat, and he and his three sisters grew up sailing. He loved it. Mostly they hated it. And so his one sister, who she turns green even looking at a boat, she was just horrified that we were going to take a young child to the sea. She knew we didn't have any experience sailing offshore, and that John was a dreamer, and that's why we were even able to do this. But to other people, it seems crazy sometimes. So she offered to take Kate. She said, just leave Kate with me. She'll be safe here. Uh, we didn't do that, and as far as our relationships, it was pretty interesting. I think we all changed during the voyage. As far as myself, when we left, I didn't want to go. I loved my life in Connecticut, where we had, friends and family and our careers and all that. And I was scared about sailing out of the sight of land. John was actually scared of sailing out of the sight of land too, though he didn't talk about it as much as I did. For me, I was really scared at the beginning, and my whole idea was, well, John, who is the sailor, and then I'll talk about my daughter next. But John, who is the sailor, he can take care of all the scary stuff. He can just sail us around, and I'll help, of course. But it's basically him. By the end of the voyage, we when we were in Guatemala, John was away on business. We were both working sporadically during this to earn money. So he's away, and Hurricane Mitch comes along. At that time, largest hurricane on record. It started as a Category 5, and it was headed for us. So I had to handle the boat with my daughter and dog. And when we started the voyage, I would have just died rather than do something like that. And I handled it and was really, proud of myself for doing that. So for me, it changed. It was empowering in a lot of ways. And also it was something that John and I had to work that out. Like when I, at various times during the voyage, when I just wasn't stepping up, and he would say, he would tell me that I needed to, that he can't do this by himself. And I realized, oh, he's right. In my mind, I've had it that this is his thing, his dream, and I was there too, and I loved it too. So, I I had to work on that. And as far as Kate, so when we left, she just looked on it as this great adventure. She wouldn't have to go to school anymore. We were doing, school on the boat. She announced before we left, she announced to her class that, she's going sailing and she's not going to school anymore. She's going to the Caribbean and snorkeling. And off she went. And then we leave. And we left in winter. We were late, as usual. And we would never have gone on the outside in the Atlantic anyway because of our inexperience. And we went on the Intracoastal Waterway, which is going through, it's actually really lovely. You go through all the southern states. John and a couple guys took the boat down to Annapolis, and then we as a family moved on the boat there and started down. But it's slow. It takes several months. You just sail to the next little anchorage or town, but you see really a lot of America, and it's charming and interesting, but it was slow. And Kate, meanwhile, on the sides of the Intercoastal Waterway, sometimes there's highways, there's planes going by. She's looking around at all these other faster modes of transportation, and she's going, how far do we have to go? And so John said, so we said, well, we're going to Florida, and then we're leaving from there. And how far is Florida? Oh, well, 1,200 miles. and she just couldn't believe we chose the slowest mode of travel. And so she got really bored during parts of it, and she's dressing up the dog and she's doing different things. And that actually turned out to be a difficulty that in places where there were no other kids, which were a lot of places. This was in the late 90s. It was before the internet really, or the internet had just like started. So we couldn't just call another boat, and say, where are you going to be? There was no means of contacting other than the radio, the ship's radio. So we were sometimes in remote places where there were no, in fact, fairly often in remote places where there were no other kids. And she was like at one point in Belize, she was so bored. She began signing all the letters home, bored in Belize. That was her sign off. So another thing I just thought of, just because it's funny, was when we were sailing, we suddenly heard her refer to her cabin. When we bought this boat, it was really a lovely sailboat, and we especially wanted a forward cabin and an aft cabin, so we'd have our private cabins. Kate would have her private space, and we would. So she had the cabin at the bow. And about a couple months into the journey, we heard her refer to it as the death cabin, and we're like, we had no idea. We thought, well, and so she figured it's just the first one to hit the rocks. We'll be fine. We'll be aft. She'll be cut in half, at the bow. And it was at one of the book signings. She was on a live stream. She wasn't there. And somebody asked about why she called it the death cabin, and I couldn't remember. And she piped in that she had seen the Titanic that year. So I had forgotten that entirely. So that was just something that I wouldn't have remembered.
That's great. Yeah, maybe not the movie you want to watch if that's what you're doing, living on a boat.
Probably not appropriate. I don't know why would we have shown her that movie at that time.
That's great.
I do want. I think I would like to say how Kate now feels about
Okay.
this.
Mm-hmm.
Because people at the book signings, people want to know, what did she think then and now? So then she thought it was an adventure, but was often bored and eventually got really lonely. That's actually why we returned, or one of the main reasons that we returned. When she looks back on it, she just thinks of it. And also at the time when we got back, the reentry was really hard. We moved to Florida. We had lived in Connecticut. John really didn't want to go up north there, and I agreed. So we lived in Florida where we didn't know anyone. And so starting at a school in fifth grade where all the kids had been together, we thought she should go to a small private school to get individualized attention since she'd had homeschooling for 3 years. And it turned out it was very cliquey, and they'd all been together for the whole time. And so that was hard and she thought they were all babies because they couldn't cross the street by themselves. And she was, crossing the river on a dinghy by herself. So that was hard when she was young. When she looks back, she really values how broadening the experience was and the time that she had with us. So, yeah, so we all took it differently. And I think for John, I think he was really, really happy to have achieved something that was really hard to pull off. We left careers in New York. We were both working in advertising in New York, and it wasn't easy to put all the pieces together to get the right boat, to figure out our careers and how could we earn money while we were cruising, and just all of that part. He really worked hard on that and made it all happen. So I think I'm of course, now that he's gone, I'm so glad that we did it. With his personality, though, he really wanted to go further. And when we got our next boat, we had a catamaran that we moved on to after Kate went to college, and he unfortunately got cancer, but he wanted to go further.
Some of the charming parts of the book were where you talked about your interactions with some of the other, let's call them characters that you meet along the way.
Yes. Yes. I thought that was one of the most interesting, I think for all of us, that was the most interesting part one of the most interesting parts of cruising, the characters that you meet, not so much while we were still in the States, but almost as soon as we left. And certainly by the time we got to Mexico, and Isla Mujeres is where I really remember initially just thinking, wow, there's a lot of characters here. We went to a potluck. We got there just before Christmas. Isla Mujeres is right at the tip of the Yucatan Peninsula, and it's a waypoint where a lot of sailors coming up from Panama and coming down from Texas or coming in from Florida or across from Europe will all meet in Isla Mujeres. So there's all different nationalities. There's lots of kids, which was great for Kate. But anyway, we go to this potluck, and there are two guys there, for example, who called themselves the Heavies. I don't at the moment remember their actual names, and they're piling their plates, with food, and they one of them had invented the camera, the underwater sea camera that is used for deep underwater photography. And he was called upon to go to all these exotic places to supervise these projects that involved that kind of camera work. So it's just we just met a lot of and then once we got to the Rio Dulce, which was actually where we had always dreamed of sailing. John read about it in a book, and we read it together, and it's where the original Tarzan movies were filmed with Johnny Weissmuller, and it's a narrow green canyon that you sail through, and there's monkeys at the top and hawks swooping around and gorgeous lush shiny green leaves and flowers, and so it just was absolutely beautiful. But the people who wind up there are like, some of them are like on the lam, or we went in once. We had we needed, by the time we got there, we'd come many thousands of miles, and we had a lot of repairs we needed to do. And we'd heard that there were cruisers who were doing repairs, as well as professionals in that area. And so John tried to call around to get some people who would work on the boat, and nobody seemed to even care to do the work. And then we finally got someone. And when we paid him, he told us to make out the check to another name. It was an alias, and it turns out he's wanted. I can't remember what it was for, but he owned a woodworking shop there. So there were a lot of characters there that we met.
That sort of leads to my next question, which is, how much time did you spend dealing with the challenges of sailing? So repairs and weather and supplies and illness or injury, or all those things that are, let's say, not the romantic side of sailing.
Yeah, I'd say that was probably I'm going to say that was probably 70% of it, dealing with all that. We were fortunate never to have any bad injuries. John once got a horrible foot infection, but we didn't have any bad injuries. Occasional, it's called jungle rot, where you get rashes or things like that. But as far as weather, that was the major one. When we were in the Bahamas, one norther after another came in. Same thing happened when we were in Isla Mujeres. So we couldn't leave. We would just be stuck places, and that got to be frustrating. Or repairs was the other big thing, actually, probably as big as weather, where you'd be waiting for a part. And you have to stay in place so they can send you the part. So which is coming from Germany or something, and you're in Belize. So we had this friend who they're in the book. This other couple, and we were really happy to meet them. They also had two kids. We met them on the Rio Dulce, and unfortunately the friendship deteriorated. But the husband of the other couple was just getting more and more frustrated, wanting to leave the Rio Dulce, because the Rio Dulce, this hurricane hole, the reason it's such a good hurricane hole is it's way, way up the river. There's no air, it's not like cool and breezy. It's hot and humid. And this is also summertime. So he just couldn't wait to get out of the Rio Dulce. And he ordered some part, but he even arranged for a friend, not a good friend, but a friend, to fly specially to the Rio Dulce to bring him. And the friend came, and it was the wrong part. So it was just, all these kind of things that would happen around repairs.
So while you were dealing with all of that, all the challenges, I imagine, and as you've alluded to, were probably moments of great joy during those years that you were sailing offshore.
Yeah, the actual sailing part, as long as the weather was pretty good, which it often was a great joy. And also when we were in port and meeting interesting people and just having fun with other people, other like-minded people who were doing this crazy thing we were doing. And for us, it was a particular joy when we were in ports that had kids. It was so much fun to meet up with other families. Like if we sailed in and we saw kids on another boat, all the kids would be just like jumping up and down, couldn't wait to meet each other. And the way they played was just such a like a wonder to all the adults. I mean, they'd be in Belize actually. We stayed on this little key. I think it doesn't exist anymore, but it was outside of Belize City. It was called Moho Key and had this tiny marina, crazy little marina, and there were actual shards, ancient Mayan shards under the sand that the kids would find when they were playing in the sand. And they'd pick mangoes, they'd climb trees. It was idyllic in some ways, and they also got were really independent. They like we taught Kate to operate our dinghy. So by herself, when she was 9, she could dinghy off to another boat. And that was something I know John and I especially liked about it, that independence.
What was Kate's reaction to the book? Has she read it? What did she think of your recollection of that time?
She did read it. She read it. She hadn't wanted to read. She read it early parts of it, and she said she didn't really need to read anymore, which I totally understand. I don't know that I'd want to if I were a character. She's a great writer. If she ever writes a book that I'm in, I don't know that I want to read it either. But before it was published, I was just concerned. She's the main character in it, and I didn't want her to be upset by anything. So she did agree to read it, and she was reading it. She didn't say anything, but I knew she told me she was reading it, and then she called to say that she loved it, and she thought I got it right, got John right, and which really made me happy.
Yeah,
and because he was already gone at that point, and the experience, and it's my perspective on it. If she ever writes one, it'll be hers, which would really be fun to read. But yeah, so I was really pleased with that. And John, when I first started writing it, he was still healthy and everything, and he read bits of it, and he said he really didn't need to read it. His view was that anything that could be said about him has already been said about him to his face, and it doesn't bother him at all. I can say whatever I want. So I took that license. I think he would be okay with it. Yeah.
Well, I'm curious. Have you always been a writer? I mean, is publishing a book, is this something you've always wanted to do?
It's something I've always wanted to do. It was like my secret dream. I wanted to do it as a kid. It wasn't so secret as a kid. I wrote a lot of stories, and my dad was like a big supporter of it. He loved to read. He had a huge library. He died when I was 10, and I think I was just so lost after I was left in a bad situation. I was pretty lost after that, and I think I kind of stopped dreaming. Though when I went to college, I did major in English initially, again thinking that maybe eventually I would be a writer. But I had a brief first marriage and to a medical student, and I agreed to support him. And I was very young. I was 19. And his parents thought that I should switch to psychology to get a better job. So I switched. I wasn't really thinking for myself yet. And then once I met John, that was one thing that I loved about him so much. I began to he saw me for what I was, and I began to think more about what I wanted. But my career was actually in market research and in advertising, and I had to write a lot of reports. Mostly what I did was focus groups, which I'm sure you know about. They were just kind of starting when I was doing them. and very ethnographic type individual interviews, like 3-4 hours long. I'd go to people's homes and learn everything there was to learn about what their needs were for breakfast products or whatever it was. And I really enjoyed doing that. And I did enjoy my career very much. I did a lot of work actually for the MTA in New York, and I loved interviewing subway riders because they'll complain about everything, and it was just fun. So for me, this is like a late dream blooming, which makes me very happy.
Do you have plans to write any more books?
Yeah, actually, I'm working on another book.
Oh, good,
So,
good. Can
yeah,
you tell us anything about it? Another
yeah.
memoir?
It's another memoir. That's my thing. I've tried fiction and it's fun, but I more memoir, I guess. And I'm pretty sure it's going to center around my dad because I lost him at a young age and he's kind of frozen in time. And I loved him very much, but wasn't able to grieve at the time. So I think it'll be something around that, claiming him, or claiming that relationship.
Good, good. Well, if people want to learn more about you, your books, find out about new releases, that sort of thing, where should they go to find you and that information?
I have a website. It's Susan-Cole, COLE.com. And they can find and I have a newsletter they can sign up for. They can find all that information there. They could also follow me on Facebook, SusanColeAuthor.com. I'm on some of the other social media, but Facebook's what I really use the most.
And if they are interested in purchasing a copy of Holding Fast, where should they go to buy it?
Yeah, it's on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, wherever you would buy your books. You could order it at your local bookstore too. Bookshop.org carries it, but Amazon, I guess, is the most popular. Actually, I forgot to mention, I recently the book actually was recently #1 on Amazon in the sailing category and travel and adventure categories, and the book also won a couple of book awards in travel and adventure. So I was pretty pleased with that.
Oh, congratulations. That's worth celebrating.
Thank you.
Well, Susan, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast. And I want to wish you luck with Holding Fast, a memoir of sailing, love, and loss. And good luck with the work in progress. We'll hopefully look forward to that. And congratulations on everything you've accomplished so far. Best of luck with the rest of your writing journey.
Oh, thank you so much.
The Bookshop at the End of the Internet is a podcast dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like any good bookshop, this podcast features a wide variety of books by the equally varied and interesting authors who felt compelled to write them. This podcast gives you a chance to meet these wonderful writers and discover your next must-read book. Listen to the authors describe their books and tell you their stories in their own words. My interviews feature books from all genres and authors from all walks of life, including those who are indie published as well as those published by small presses and large publishing houses. Looking for unique, not so easy to find books for yourself, a friend, or a book club? Tune into this podcast and find your newest favorite author or maybe a soon-to-be bestseller. This podcast, like all the best bookshops, is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. Tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book. You never know what treasures you might find in the Bookshop at the End of the Internet.